The Sahel sun bore witness to a scene that startled an entire continent. Rows upon rows of bulldozers, excavators, graders, and compactors, 764 machines in total, gleamed like an army of steel in the capital of Burkina Faso. No IMF banners fluttered. No World Bank officials stood grinning with scissors. No European diplomat prepared a lecture on fiscal responsibility. Instead, silence, deliberate, defiant, filled the air. It was not charity. It was not aid. It was sovereignty, bulldozed into existence by hands that refused to beg. For decades, Nigeria, with its rivers of oil, Kenya, with its digital corridors, and South Africa, with its veins of platinum, have danced to the tune of foreign capital. Yet here stood a landlocked nation, scarred by sanctions and written off as fragile, declaring with metal rather than words that Africa can build Africa. This was not an isolated delivery of machines. It was a turning point, a rupture in the script of dependency. Stay with us. This is not just about machines. It is a turning point in Africa's story. Subscribe and walk with us. On a blazing afternoon in Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso, history was not written in ink but in iron. Bulldozers, excavators, graders, and compactors stretched in disciplined rows, 764 in number, their steel glinting under the Sahel sun. This was not a spectacle orchestrated by foreign partners. There were no donor flags decorating the machines. No ambassadors posed for photographs. No IMF delegation hovered with reminders of repayment schedules. What unfolded was a ceremony unlike the countless ribbon cuttings that Africa has endured, a silent assertion of sovereignty. For too long, the story of infrastructure in Africa has been scripted elsewhere. Bridges rise, but they carry plaques that thank Europe. Roads stretch across valleys, but the asphalt is credited to World Bank loans. Hospitals open their doors, but the speeches are drowned in donor logos. This cycle has bred a dangerous illusion that African development cannot exist without foreign validation. It is an illusion that shackled generations to dependency, forcing leaders to equate begging with governance. Burkina Faso shattered that illusion in a single day. The machines assembled in Ouagadougou were not borrowed, donated, or leased. They were purchased outright, financed by Burkinabe hands for Burkinabe roads. The absence of external presence was the loudest message. Silence became power. Without a single word spoken, the machines told a story. We can build without you. To the untrained eye, this might have seemed like an infrastructure delivery, a government acquiring equipment to pave roads. But symbolism often outweighs substance. These machines were not merely tools of construction. They were declarations of independence forged in steel. They represented a defiance of the assumption that sovereignty must always be mediated through foreign aid. Observers across the continent felt the tremor. Nigeria, endowed with oil wealth, yet trapped in cycles of debt, suddenly looked smaller in comparison. Kenya, celebrated as a hub of innovation, yet reliant on World Bank loans, found its narrative of modernity shaken. South Africa, rich in platinum but still beholden to global capital, saw its status questioned. And there stood Burkina Faso, a nation landlocked, sanctioned, and dismissed as fragile, delivering what larger economies could not: development without dependency. It was, as some commentators admitted through clenched teeth, a political earthquake. For decades, Burkina Faso had been relegated to the margins of African news cycles, appearing only in headlines of coups, poverty, or insecurity. Rarely was it praised for setting the pace of continental development. Now, in a single stroke, it had embarrassed giants. The imagery of 764 machines lined up in unison was not just about metal, it was about dignity. The emotional charge was impossible to miss. For ordinary Africans watching, the rows of machines gleaming under the sun stirred pride and provoked anger. Pride that one of their own had defied dependency. Anger that their own leaders, ruling over larger economies and richer resources, had chosen the path of begging rather than building. The shock was visceral. Burkina Faso had broken a spell. And yet, for all the spectacle, a question lingered in the air like heat rising from asphalt. How could a sanctioned, resource-strapped nation afford such a monumental display? What hidden well of wealth had been tapped to transform a fragile state into an architect of sovereignty? If a small landlocked nation can defy dependency, what else might be possible? The images spread across Africa like wildfire. 764 machines standing in formation, not a single foreign flag among them. For many, the silence of that ceremony was more powerful than any speech. No minister bowed in gratitude. No donor was applauded. Instead, the message was wordless yet thunderous. Sovereignty can stand without permission. Across the continent, reactions ranged from disbelief to admiration. In Lagos, radio hosts debated whether this was a sustainable move or a stunt. Their callers divided between pride and suspicion. In Nairobi, commentators on evening television tried to downplay the event as symbolic, yet their voices carried unease. In Johannesburg, business analysts whispered that the announcement could ignite questions no government wished to face. If Burkina Faso could achieve this, what excuse did they have? The reaction was not confined to Africa. In Washington, officials spoke carefully of risk to investment confidence. In Brussels, European policymakers murmured about fiscal sustainability. These phrases were coded language, diplomatic veneers covering deeper fears. What they truly meant was this: a precedent had been set that threatened decades of influence. The aid-dependent model, which had kept African governments within reach of donor institutions, had been punctured by a landlocked nation under sanctions. The shock reverberated through media as well. Newspapers across Africa carried the story on their front pages. Opinion writers wrestled with the uncomfortable truth. If one of the continent's smaller economies could marshal its own resources for development, then dependency was not destiny, it was a choice. And that truth was more destabilizing than any protest. Because unlike rhetoric, the machines could not be dismissed. They were physical proof, standing tall under the Sahel's sun. Within Burkina Faso, the emotional response was electric. Crowds in Ouagadougou celebrated not just the machines, but what they represented. Social media brimmed with photos of the rows of bulldozers captioned with words like dignity, pride, and sovereignty. For citizens long accustomed to seeing donor logos attached to every project, this spectacle was a rupture, an awakening. The state was proving that it could deliver without bowing. The government's silence during the event became a weapon in itself. Silence in this case was not emptiness, but defiance. In the absence of donor speeches, the machines became the orators. They spoke of a nation reclaiming its agency. They whispered to Mali, to Niger, to every corner of Africa still shackled by aid. You do not need permission to be sovereign. But pride was not the only reaction. Fear threaded its way through the corridors of neighboring capitals. In Abuja, politicians worried that citizens would begin asking dangerous questions about oil wealth squandered on debt. In Nairobi, technocrats wondered how long their World Bank-driven projects could be justified in the face of Burkinabe self-reliance. In Pretoria, leaders feared that the contrast would erode their claims to continental leadership. The shock lay not in the number of machines, but in the symbolism. Steel became scripture. Rows of excavators became paragraphs of a new political text. Independence, once spoken of as a dream, was now displayed as machinery. The ceremony's silence echoed louder than any anthem. It was the roar of dignity. And yet, beneath the admiration and fear, a deeper question unsettled everyone who saw those images. Burkina Faso was under sanctions. Its reserves were limited, and its economy had long been strangled by foreign control. Where, then, had the money come from? Machines of such scale do not simply appear. They must be bought, transported, and maintained. The truth could not be avoided. There was a hidden wellspring that made this possible, a radical decision that broke with decades of economic orthodoxy. The moment of pride was inseparable from the riddle of its financing. Africans everywhere, from Bamako to Kinshasa, from Nairobi to Johannesburg, leaned in with curiosity and suspicion. How had Burkina Faso pulled this off? What was the secret source of sovereignty that larger, richer nations had never dared to tap? But how could a sanctioned, resource-strapped nation afford such a feat? The mystery of financing was soon unraveled. Behind the spectacle of machines lay a radical decision that redrew the foundations of Burkina Faso's economy. For decades, the nation had been one of Africa's top gold producers, yet its people remained among the poorest. Foreign corporations, often shielded by local elites, extracted ton after ton of ore, shipping it abroad to be refined elsewhere. The state collected only meager taxes, enough to pay bureaucrats, but never enough to transform the country. Aid donors filled the gap, presenting themselves as saviors even as Burkina Faso's wealth leaked away. Captain Ibrahim Traoré turned that script upside down. With decisive policies, his government seized control of strategic mines, froze exploitative contracts, and redirected the flow of revenue. For the first time since independence, Burkinabe Gold financed Burkinabe development. The machines lined up in Ouagadougou were not gifts from Europe, not loans from Washington, but the tangible fruits of sovereignty reclaimed from the soil. This was not rhetoric. It was policy crystallized in steel. The impact on civil life was immediate. Citizens who had grown accustomed to promises and donor conferences suddenly saw physical proof of change. Buses ran more frequently in the cities. New processing plants began turning wasted harvests into packaged goods. Hospitals that had long been stalled on donor pledges now rose with national funding. The message was unmistakable. Wealth was no longer vanishing into foreign accounts or international bureaucracies. It was being channeled into the daily lives of Burkina Faso citizens. This transformation altered politics as well. For years, legitimacy in many African states was built not on delivery, but on negotiation with foreign donors. Leaders gained credibility by managing aid pipelines, not by meeting the needs of their people. That order collapsed once Traoré cut the dependency cord. The government now lived and died by its ability to deliver with its own revenues. In doing so, it reshaped the contract between state and citizen. For ordinary people, the psychological shift was as significant as the physical projects. They no longer associated progress with foreign generosity. They saw their own nation's wealth at work. Pride replaced resignation. Instead of clapping for donor logos, they applauded machines that carried no foreign insignia. Sovereignty became visible, not as an abstract slogan, but as roads, hospitals, and schools built with Burkina Faso money. This governance revolution also struck at corruption. Dependency on aid had long created a class of professional rent seekers, officials who thrived on managing donor projects, extracting kickbacks, and thriving in secrecy. By cutting off aid pipelines, the government strangled their oxygen. Visibility became the strongest weapon. Every machine, every new road, every processing plant was a public reminder that state funds were no longer disappearing. In Ouagadougou, steel lined up under the sun became the most effective audit in history. The political consequences extended beyond Burkina Faso. Across the continent, citizens began asking sharper questions of their own governments. If a sanctioned nation could reclaim its gold and buy hundreds of machines, why could oil-rich Nigeria not fund infrastructure without loans? Why could Kenya, with its agricultural potential, still depend on imported wheat? Why did South Africa, with its industrial base, still bow to global corporations? The symbolism of Burkina Faso's decision was contagious, igniting debates from Bamako to Johannesburg. And yet, pride was balanced by a looming challenge. Gold can buy machines, but it cannot feed people. Sovereignty begins in the mines, but it must extend to the fields. Traoré himself recognized this. The next battlefield was food sovereignty. Because what dignity is left if a nation still eats from a donor's hand? Here lies the cliffhanger for Africa's future. The Ibrahim Traoré coup was not only about seizing political power, it was about seizing economic agency. But sovereignty, once reclaimed, must be defended on multiple fronts. Yet gold alone cannot feed a nation. The next battlefield lay in the fields. The tremors from Ouagadougou did not stop at Africa's borders. In Addis Ababa, the African Union watched with caution. The official statements were muted, couched in language of regional stability and developmental pathways. Yet beneath the diplomatic tone was unease. If Burkina Faso could mobilize its own resources without donors, what would stop others from rejecting the established aid system that AU summits so often reinforced? In Abuja and Nairobi, political elites scrambled for narratives to defend themselves. Some dismissed Burkina Faso's achievement as unsustainable. Others claimed that the purchase of machines was a one-off spectacle. But no amount of rhetoric could erase the image of hundreds of bulldozers standing under the Sahel sun, proof that dependency was not inevitable. Western capitals responded with familiar vocabulary. In Washington, officials raised concerns about investor confidence. In Brussels, European Union policymakers spoke of fiscal sustainability. These phrases mask deeper anxieties. The Burkina Faso model threatened decades of structured dependence, where aid was not charity but leverage, a system of control dressed as benevolence. Paris, with its historic ties to the Sahel, was perhaps the most unsettled. French media alternated between skepticism and alarm. Analysts noted that gold revenues once flowing into European vaults were now redirected into Burkina Faso infrastructure. For a region long treated as France's backyard, the symbolism was dangerous. If sovereignty could be mined from Burkina Faso soil, why not from Niger's uranium or Mali's cotton? The implications extended beyond economics. International institutions feared a contagion effect. If one small nation under sanctions could reclaim dignity through its own wealth, what would happen if larger economies followed suit? Would the entire edifice of aid dependency collapse? Would Africa begin to negotiate with the world not from a position of need, but from one of sovereignty? For ordinary Africans abroad, the announcement resonated as a form of quiet revolution. Social media across the diaspora lit up with pride. Commentators called it the Burkina Faso Revolution, not because machines alone could change the world, but because they embodied a shift in political imagination. Dependency was no longer destiny, yet with hope came risk. International backlash could take many forms, from economic isolation to subtle political pressure. Sanctions already weighed heavily on Burkina Faso. Greater assertiveness might invite harsher responses, but in that risk lay the promise of leadership. By refusing to bow, Burkina Faso had forced the world to acknowledge that aid is not the only path, and that sovereignty is not a distant dream, but a choice. If this revolution in the Sahel spreads, how will the old guardians of aid respond? Burkina Faso has lit a torch in the Sahel, but a torch can either guide or burn. The 764 machines are a beginning, not an end. They are proof of possibility, but also a reminder of fragility. Sovereignty, once reclaimed, must be nurtured like a seed, watered with governance, protected from corruption, and cultivated with vision. The opportunities are immense. Roads carved by those machines can connect forgotten villages, sparking trade across a landlocked nation. Gold revenues, if managed transparently, can fund schools and hospitals that anchor dignity for generations. Investments in agriculture can transform hunger from a weapon of control into a pillar of independence. Each of these steps adds brick upon brick to a fortress of sovereignty, but the risks are equally stark. External powers unsettled by this defiance may tighten economic or diplomatic pressure. Sanctions could deepen, investment could be withheld, and narratives of instability could be amplified in global media. History shows that when African nations challenge the order of dependency, they often face attempts to isolate or undermine them. The path ahead is steep, and Burkina Faso must walk it with resilience and foresight. Domestically, the challenge lies in sustaining public trust. Machines can build roads, but trust is built only by consistent delivery. If the gains of sovereignty are consumed by corruption or squandered on vanity projects, hope could wither into cynicism. The government must ensure that visibility remains its shield, that citizens continue to see their wealth manifest in tangible ways. Regionally, Burkina Faso has the chance to inspire. Its defiance could ripple across Mali, Niger, and beyond, feeding a broader movement for African independence. But inspiration alone is not enough. A network of cooperation must emerge. Sahelian nations pooling resources, sharing knowledge, and standing together when external pressures mount. Sovereignty must be collective to be enduring. Above all, the future of Burkina Faso hinges on whether it can transform defiance into durability. Courage sparked this moment, but only discipline can sustain it. Sovereignty is not a slogan. It is a system built slowly with sweat and sacrifice. The machines stand as silent witnesses, waiting for their engines to roar to life. They are not the end of the story, but the prologue. Roads yet to be paved, harvests yet to be gathered, and futures yet to be secured all depend on the choices made from this fragile victory. But can this fragile seed grow into a continental harvest? The story of Burkina Faso is not about machines alone. It is about a people reclaiming what was always theirs. 764 bulldozers, graders, and excavators may seem like cold steel, but in truth, they are vessels of dignity. They are declarations that sovereignty is not charity and that independence is not gifted. It is seized. Gold, long a symbol of plunder, has been redirected to build instead of bleed. Fields once dependent on imported grain are being tilled with new resolve. Food is no longer a tool of manipulation, but a frontier of resistance. And governance, once warped by aid and corruption, is being recast in the harsh light of accountability. Burkina Faso is proving that sovereignty is not a future dream. It is a living reality that can be built brick by brick, harvest by harvest, machine by machine. This journey has not been easy. Sanctions weigh heavily. Critics circle, waiting for failure. External powers whisper doubts about stability and sustainability. Yet the silence of Ouagadougou's ceremony still echoes across Africa. It whispers to Nigerians weary of oil wealth squandered. It whispers to Kenyans watching debts pile higher. It whispers to South Africans wondering why platinum does not buy independence. And it asks them all, if Burkina Faso can do this, what excuse remains? The Ibrahim Traoré coup was not just the seizing of political authority, it was the seizing of possibility. By redirecting gold into sovereignty, By investing in food to feed the nation, by cutting aid to strangle corruption, Burkina Faso has redrawn the map of African imagination. This is the essence of the Burkina Faso Revolution. Not machines, not minds, not fields alone, but the courage to prove that dependency was never destiny. And so the question is passed to you, the viewer. What future do you see for Africa if more leaders choose dignity over dependency? What could this continent become if sovereignty was planted in every field, mined in every vein, and forged in every hand? If this resonates with your sense of justice and pride, subscribe, share, and let the story of sovereignty travel further than any machine can.